This video is an introduction to how to read the Bible if you've never read it before. This video is really meant for somebody who doesn't know anything of what to expect when they open up this book. So, the first thing that you want to do when you're going to read the Bible is you want to find a good translation. My personal recommendations are going to be, if you haven't read a lot and you're not overly well read, I would go with the NIV. If you're pretty decently well read, but you've never read the Bible, then I would go with the ESV. If you want a slightly more complex translation, that's a little bit more close to the original language. If you just want something a bit more simple, though, go with the NIV. This here that I'm holding is King James Version. You will commonly find the King James Version, but I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who is new to reading the Bible, unless you're really into Shakespearean sort of English. So, the Bible consists of 66 books if you are reading from the Protestant canon. And that's the smallest of all the canons that any of the Christian churches will have, but it is the most commonly used. And every one of the books that the Protestants read, every other denomination that has a larger canon uses every single one of those books, and very often sees these books as more authoritative in a sense. So, when you get into it, there is a handful of different sections. So the first 5 books are called the Pentateuch, or the Law, and those books consist of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These first 5 books basically tell the story. It starts in creation, how God created the world, and then goes on to explain how a certain family is established. God creates covenant through Abraham and through his lineage, through Noah before that, and this sort of covenant continues to pass through a certain generation of people until eventually a group of people, Jewish people, are enslaved by the Egyptians at the very end of Genesis. And then in Exodus, the story goes on of how they were enslaved for a long time, but then God decides to rise up and lead them out of slavery, out of Egypt. So that's the book of Exodus. So then Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is going to be a legal code that is going to cover a lot of the different Old Testament laws, and is going to tell the story and continue the story of how they're going through the desert to a land that God had promised to their ancestors. Now, we continue from that into Joshua and Judges, Ruth, and all these books forward are going to be what are called the historical books. So the first books are a law code and also a historical kind of story. Of course, some people see it as more mythological. There's debates, and I'm not going to put one firm position here. But you get into Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and all these books forward are the historical books. And this is the next section. Joshua continues how Joshua, a military leader of the Jewish people who is under Moses, leads a military division of the Jewish people to basically conquer the land they were promised. Because Moses and a lot of the people who were with him were cursed not to enter the land because of their sin. So Joshua continues into that. Then after that we get into the book of Judges and Ruth. Judges and Ruth takes place after the time of Joshua. And the Judges basically tells the story of how God raises up people, and these people are righteous, and they stand firm in the truth of God. And then after they die, or later in time, they fall away, and then, the land falls into debauchery. They fall away from God. They start worshiping idols. They start committing sin. They start even sacrificing their own children to pagan deities. And then God allows them to fall to other nations. And then God again raises somebody up to basically rescue them. And then after this person has been raised up, that person dies or falls away. And then this repeated cycle happens of the land has a mighty ruler, the land is saved, and then they fall short and fail. So and then during that same time, the book of Ruth, which comes after this, actually takes place at the same time as the book of Judges. And the book of Ruth goes over the story of a lady and basically her marriage. And it shows a very different side of the time period of the book of Judges. But particularly, the reason this story is important is because it shows the ancestry and begins the lineage of David the king, who's going to be very important in these next stories. So 1st and 2nd Samuel tells the story of the Jewish monarchy. So previous to this, there wasn't a monarchy, but in the book of 1 Samuel, a monarchy is actually established, something that God is opposed to, but God allows it to happen, and then a king named Saul, who is not a good king, and God rejects him. He goes on to have some disagreements with another young man, David, who God does look upon and knows that he will be the next king. There's disputes, a lot of disagreements, but David carries himself very nobly, while Saul carries himself quite wickedly most of the time. And eventually David becomes king. And then this story basically carries through 1st and 2nd Samuel. Then 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles tells the story of, largely, there's a little bit about David in there, but these stories tell largely the story of the monarchy of Israel as it continued. And through these stories, there's a lot of what you'd even call, they don't do very good. I mean, it's the story of God rises up certain righteous people, the righteous people stand up, and then they fail over and over again. And then God raises somebody else up again, much like the book of Judges, and, they're righteous, but then they fall away again, and the land falls into apostasy and darkness. And this story basically continued throughout the entirety of these stories. So then after we get into 2nd Chronicles, we have Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. These 3 books are also part of the history, and they take place largely after the time of the Kings and the Chronicles. And then we get into, I'm not going to take too much time on that, then we get into the wisdom literature. So the wisdom literature consists of the book of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, and then Song of Solomon. So the book of Job is a really interesting book, and it's kind of a difficult book, but it kind of gets into the idea of why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And a lot of people are not satisfied with the answer in this book, because it is a hard answer. Basically, in the end of this book, God comes out of the whirlwind, because Job had basically everything taken away from him. And all his friends and him have been debating on whether or not he was wicked and if the sin was deserved or if it was something else. Well, when God comes out of the whirlwind and sees Job, he basically asks them, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And the point really seems to be, God is saying, this is beyond your comprehension. You can't understand why I allow these things to happen. Because, I'm infinitely higher than you are. But this, it's a very difficult answer. But it's much like if we tried to, I'd imagine, explain to our dog why we aren't always home. Why do we go to work? So we go from Job to the Psalms. The Psalms are a book of poetry. It's a book of worship and poetry. And a lot of it is ascribed to David. And this, it's a really beautiful section. And if you're just going to sit down and read one chapter at a time, this is really the place to go. And a lot of beautiful hymns, and Christians to this day often pray and sing these different psalms. So then you get into the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are all ascribed traditionally to have been written by Solomon the king. And Proverbs is basically general wisdom. This is the wisdom that is generally true. Now, Proverbs are short sayings that aren't meant to be taken as literal in the sense of this is what's always going to happen. Instead, when you read a proverb, you should take it as this is a general truth. If I do this, my life will usually be better. Now, whereas the book of Job's and the book of Ecclesiastes, which comes after this, is more so on the side of exceptions. Ecclesiastes is kind of a almost depressing sort of book. The book of Ecclesiastes often says, uses this term, vanity of vanities, all is vanities, and then it goes on, what does it profit a man to do this or to do that? And basically, it's a complex book, and there's a handful of ways that people actually interpret it, but it's a book that deals deeply with the meaninglessness of everything. So then you go in from Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon is really interesting because it's Hebrew love poetry. It's a very unique genre, and a lot of the metaphors that are made seem very odd to us in our modern day. Like complimenting a woman's hair as they look like, because it looks like sheep. Is, kind of a weird way to describe things. Or, saying your neck looks like the Tower of David. So there is really funny parts in the Song of Solomon. But that's specifically because of the historical context. And when you're reading the Bible, you want to understand the historical context that you're in, and it's helpful to understand the genre that you're in. So now after you get into Song of Solomon, you pass that, you get into the major prophets, which is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, which was also written by Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then I believe they usually throw Daniel in with the major prophets. And so those are the major prophets. And what major prophets mean is just that the books are long, whereas the other prophets have very short writings. I'm not going to go too deep into the prophets, but the prophets are more complex in their reading than these narrative stories. So the earlier stories are all Hebrew narrative or wisdom literature. The prophets are a bit more complex, and I wouldn't recommend reading the prophets first. Now, you definitely should read the prophets, but that wouldn't be the first place that I would go. I would start with some of the narrative or some of the books in the New Testament, as we'll get into. So now you go from Daniel. Daniel's actually pretty easy to read, though, out of the prophets, and so is Jonah. Okay, so you get in from there. You have Hosea. Hosea tells the story of a man who basically is called to marry a woman of ill repute to demonstrate how Israel is much like a wife that has gone astray and has ran off with other men. And it's basically drawing a picture of how Israel acts towards God, and just showing the depths of the awfulness of the way that the Israelite people are acting towards God. And it shows the faithfulness of God, and that he's willing to pay for his people at a high price. And there's even some foreshadowing to New Testament pictures that you'll see in that book. You get into Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah. Jonah's really interesting. Everyone probably knows that story with the guy who gets eaten by a big fish. Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, and a lot of my pronunciations are not perfect because I guess I'm very Anglo-Saxon and I can't pronounce Hebrew names very well. But, you know, and then you go on, and then you have Zechariah and Malachi. Malachi's really interesting, and the way that it ties in, especially to the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, is really cool to me. And there's just this picture of, you know, behold, I send my messenger before my face. And there's all this, like, very powerful, strong imagery. I very much enjoy the last two chapters, especially of the book of Malachi. Then you get into the New Testament. So if you are going to actually start reading the Bible, and I will give recommendations at the end of this on where I would start reading it, but for most people, I would recommend you start in the New Testament. So we have St. Matthew is the first of the books. St. Matthew begins with a genealogy. And this genealogy, in some ways, bridges the Old and the New Testament, because this genealogy is drawing back and showing how the figure Jesus associates to the entire Old Testament story. And that's why this first section of genealogy is so important. And the Gospel of Matthew is really written to a Jewish audience. And the Gospel of Matthew is constantly calling back to the Old Testament. It's constantly referencing books or passages in the books that came before. And it's showing how a lot of fulfillment has been fulfilled in Jesus, and how he is fulfilling all these Old Testament things. And this book was really meant to a Jewish audience, largely to teach them who Christ was, and he was expecting that they knew the Old Testament well. Mark, on the other hand, was written, I believe, to a Roman audience. Mark is the first of all the Gospels written. It is the earliest Gospel account that we have of Jesus. And it's slightly shorter and more stripped down than the other Gospels. It is the shortest of all the Gospels, and a lot of the other Gospels probably use this Gospel as a framework in writing their own Gospel. And you'll even see language parallels, which is how we know that the people who wrote Matthew and Luke probably had access to the Gospel of Mark and were using it to assist them in writing their own account of the life of Jesus. And in Matthew, you'll get a birth narrative, and in Luke, you will. In Mark, you just get thrown into it. You have John the Baptist, preparing the way of the Lord. Boom, Jesus appears. Repent, the kingdom of God is at hand. That's Mark. Mark just throws you into it, and Mark is a book of action. Whereas Matthew calls back a lot. It's a little bit slower, a little bit more nuanced. Luke is to a Greek audience, and Luke has the birth narrative, tells a little bit more of the early life of Jesus. And then you get in from Luke, and you continue, basically through the same story, rather similar, except for it's written mostly to a Greek audience. And there's certain areas where you'll just get certain details that you won't get in the other Gospels of Jesus' life. Then the fourth Gospel is the Gospel of John. St. John wrote his Gospel last of all. This was the latest of all the Gospels written. It was probably likely written somewhere between 85 and 100 AD. So it's a little bit later than the other Gospels. Still not impossible that John would have written it, though. He would have been an old man. And even when you look at church history and church accounts, church historians and the tradition of the church has always held that John wrote the Gospel of John at a very old age. So there's no reason to think that John necessarily didn't write this Gospel or the historical figure on just like the time period. It's hypothetically possible. So St. John, his Gospel starts out very differently from the others. It starts out with a possibly even like a traditional Christian hymn. And it basically goes, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word is God. So it's starting out with this very theological point. It's making strong theological points, and it's trying to basically tell you, who is this Jesus, and how does he relate to his Father? The Gospel of John is deeply theological, and it starts the book by saying Jesus is God's Word, who is God. And this Word created all things through himself. And then this Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then we beheld his glory, glory of that of the only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. So we have all this very powerful language that we get from the Gospel of John. Deep, theological, very mystical, and distinct from the other Gospels. And John is just a wonderful author and a wonderful writer. After that, you get into the book of Acts. So the book of Luke, as I mentioned, it actually has a sequel to it, which is called the book of Acts, written by the same person. And the book of Acts tells the story of, after Jesus' death, how the early church began. This is basically a church history. This is the first church history you'll get. And the book of Acts covers the story of the apostles, how they spread the gospel across the world. And this is basically the last of all the narrative stories. And you're going to be introduced to different figures like Paul, and a lot of different people are actually authors of later books in the New Testament. Now we have the epistles of Paul. So the first epistle of Paul, an epistle means letter. That's Latin. So we have Romans, and that's the first one. This is the book that controversially and famously Martin Luther read to come to the doctrine of salvation by faith alone. This is a doctrine that I, as a Protestant, will agree with, and it's something that is found in earlier church writings. But, you know, this is really the document that got people to have the Reformation, is heavily from the exegesis of the book of Romans. And then you have 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and each of these letters were written to a certain church by St. Paul. And so we get 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians, Ephesians. I'm going pretty quick through all of this, although none of these books are to really be skipped over. And Paul wrote the most books of the New Testament. And then we have Philippians. I absolutely love Philippians. It's a rather short book. It's about 4 chapters, and it has some very deep theology. Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon. And, I mean, there's a lot that I could get into in Paul's writings. Paul is so important to really our understanding and documentation of early church history, and St. Paul's writings are actually the earliest documentation that we have of the early Christian movement. These are the first documents we have, is Paul's early writings. It's not the Gospels, it's not anything else. Paul was the first to write about the Christian movement. Then we get into the Epistle to the Hebrews. So, Paul's epistles to the Hebrew is, well, actually, I shouldn't go that far. The Epistle to the Hebrews has been accredited by some to St. Paul, by others, many different groups. So, the Epistle to the Hebrews likely wasn't written by Paul. It could have been written by Paul. That's been disputed throughout church history. We don't know who the author of the book of Hebrews is, which is very interesting. But there has been dispute, and when you read what it says, there's evidence that it was written by somebody who was in close association to Paul, even if it wasn't Paul. And there's reasons to think that it wasn't written by Paul, such as the way that it's written is different than how Paul normally writes. And another difference that comes from it is that he doesn't sign his name on it. Paul, in all his letters, says that Paul wrote these letters. The Hebrews is anonymous. It doesn't say that. which is a little bit odd because Paul always signs his own letters in every other book that we have of his. So after we get into Hebrews, we get into the Epistle of James. James is interesting, and James is very practical in what he says, and he heavily emphasizes the importance of good works. Then, after this, we have 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and these writings are attributed to St. Peter, the apostle, one of the followers of Jesus, who you'll hear heavily about in all of the Gospels and in the book of Acts. And 1 Peter is, it's really a solid work. 2 Peter is even, in my opinion, I tend to like 2 Peter better than 1 Peter. I like both the writings, though. And they both have very deep nuances to them. 2 Peter, I don't know, there's just certain parts about that have like deep phrases that really call and resonate to me. So I love 2 Peter. And also 2 Peter is interesting because it mentions the earlier letters of St. Paul. And not only does it mention his letters, it puts them alongside the other scriptures, which is probably our earliest historical account of there being a New Testament canon being written by the followers of Jesus that is equivalent to the Old Testament. This is our earliest documentation of that, probably comes from 2 Peter. Then we get into 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. So the Gospel of John, as I mentioned earlier, that deep theological gospel, the very same author wrote 3 other letters. 1 John, in a lot of ways, just deepens the commentary and the mystery that we explore in the Gospel of John. And I don't know, I love 1 John. I read that letter over and over again. And then 2 John and 3 John are basically pretty short and kind of not overly helpful in our theological understanding. Like, there's a few helpful things, such as, the importance of not being a Gnostic. And Gnostics basically believe that the material is bad and the immaterial is good, and therefore because the immaterial is good and Jesus is good, then Jesus couldn't have been material. But the Bible over and over teaches again that Jesus came in the flesh. And 2 John, I believe it is, says very clearly that, yes, whoever says that Jesus Christ did not come in the flesh, he is the Antichrist. So yes, you have to believe that Jesus came as a human. That's central to Christianity. And then, 2nd and 3rd John, but most of those letters are, hey, I'm going to come over and tell you more about this later. Then you have the book of Jude. Jude is really interesting, and it quotes from certain apocryphal Old Testament texts, which is also very interesting. Jude is very short. It's 1 chapter, and, it just is an interesting book to me, and it's a very short book, so you can read it very fast if you're interested in it. But it talks about, God, like, putting angels who seem to have rebelled in prison, which kind of deepens the lore. Peter also talks about this a little bit. And it's interesting to wonder who wrote first, Peter or Jude, because it's obvious that both of these authors were aware, or one of these authors was aware of the other one's writings, and seems to carry over the same reasoning that was in the other letter, in their own letter. So interesting enough, but there is certain distinctions, which aren't opposed to one another, but they just clarify certain nuances. So you kind of asked, well, who wrote first? And then you have the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is the weirdest of all the New Testament books. And it is a apocalypse. Apocalyptic literature was written, it was very, very common in this time period. There was a lot of different apocalypses that you'd read during the intertestamental period. The book of Daniel, in some sense, is an apocalypse. And these apocalypses basically are talking about things that are, it's disputed on what the book of Revelation means. But apocalypses basically tell about very, very weird imagery. You're going to have these weird images, and these weird images aren't meant to be taken specifically always literally. You have to interpret whether or not they should be taken literally, or as something that is representing something else. And apocalyptic literature can definitely get weird, though, and it's very, very hard to exegete because it's a lot of different pictures, and when you're trying to exegete a text, you want to be able to read it in its context, but apocalypse is just so complex, and especially if you have this element of, like, well, I believe that this is divinely inspired, so you don't have to tie it to the time period that it was written in, then it can get even more complex and even more deep. And basically the book of Revelation is hard to exegete, and you should be very cautious when somebody says, the Bible tells you this is true because this obscure passage in Revelation says so. When you look at this picture definitely means this thing, because people have been doing that for thousands of years, and very often they prove themselves very, very wrong. So be cautious when somebody says, this weird, obscure text from a apocalyptic literature means this. Be cautious of that, because apocalyptic literature is very hard to properly exegete. So that is the Bible. That's basically a quick overview of all the different books of the Bible. So if you are simply... Okay, so